I never believed in hauntings. Not really anyway. Sure, I had the usual stories, campfire whispers in high school, drunken dares to spend the night in the old slaughterhouse on Maynard Road, the occasional late-night YouTube spiral through ghost hunters yelling at dusty basements. But I always chalked those things up to tricks of the mind, the power of suggestion, and a good old fear of the unknown. It wasn't until I moved back into my family home that I started to think otherwise. My name's Caleb Wren. I'm 33 now, divorced, and a father to a quiet, sweet 5-year-old named Lucy. When my parents passed, 6 months apart, both sudden, I inherited their old Victorian house just outside of East Haven, Massachusetts. The house where I grew up. At first, I considered selling it. I had no intention of dragging Lucy into the same creaking halls and shadowy corners that I used to fear as a child. But money was tight, and the thought of trying to rent something else while a fully paid house sat waiting felt stupid. Besides, Lucy seemed to like the idea of moving into Grandma and Grandpa's big house, as she called it. The move was uneventful. Cold, damp October. The kind where the air feels like it's already half snow. The house was just as I remembered it, tall and narrow, with dark wood floors, ornate trim, and a gabled attic that always smelled like mildew and mothballs. What I didn't remember was the attic door being nailed shut. It was the day after we moved in. I had just gotten Lucy to bed and was wandering around trying to decide what to do with the last few unpacked boxes. One of them, labeled Cal's old room, had my childhood books, some school trophies, and the tattered blanket I used to drag everywhere as a toddler. Nostalgia hit me like a warm breeze. Then I noticed the attic door at the end of the hall. It was different. There were 4 thick nails hammered into the frame, not the kind of thing my dad would have done lightly. He was obsessive about keeping the house proper, nothing that might damage the finish or the original woodwork. I got a hammer from the toolbox in the kitchen and pulled the nails one by one. Each came loose with a whine of old wood, like the house didn't want to give it up. Inside, the attic was just as musty and dark as I remembered. A single pull-string bulb lit the space in a yellow cone of light. The rest faded quickly into black. There were boxes, dozens of them, some with my parents' old tax documents, some with Christmas ornaments wrapped in 1980s newspaper. But one stack of boxes caught my attention. They were labeled photos, not for disposal. Inside was a treasure trove. Decades of family history, dusty photo albums, loose Polaroids, even an old wedding portrait of my great-grandparents with their faces just slightly out of frame. And then I saw the moss. At first, I thought it was just mold. It coated the edges of one specific album, 1992, 1997. A thick, velvet green film, clinging to the leather like it had grown there over time. I rubbed at it with a rag, but it didn't come off. Not even a little. It didn't smell like mold. It smelled earthy, like fresh soil, like something still alive. I left the album for last. I flipped through the others first, smiling at photos of birthday parties, summer cookouts, my mother in her garden. When I finally opened the moss-covered one, something was wrong. The photos had changed. I don't mean they were damaged. I mean they were different. There were pictures of me and my younger brother, Eric, sitting on the front steps. Only, Eric was never that pale. His eyes were wrong. Too dark. His expression blank, mouth slightly open, like someone had told him to smile, and he hadn't understood how. In another photo, we stood in the backyard with our father. But our father's hands weren't resting on our shoulders. They were just hanging there, hovering behind us, as if caught in the middle of reaching out. The further into the album I went, the stranger it got. People's eyes were always just a little off-center. Faces were blurred, but not from motion, just the face like it had been smeared with a thumb. Background shifted. A tree that didn't exist in our yard appeared in several photos, gnarled and leafless. And always, somewhere in the distance, was that moss, creeping up a wall, coating a swing set, spiraling up the trunk of a tree I couldn't place. That night, I dreamed of my old bedroom, but it wasn't quite right. The colors were faded. The bed was covered in moss, and something was breathing slowly beneath the floorboards. The morning after I found the moss-covered photo album, I told myself I'd imagine the whole thing. Dreams could mess with memory, especially if you looked at old photos right before bed. That's what I figured. That's what I wanted to believe. But when I went to the attic the next morning, the album was sitting in the same place. Only now, it was open to a photo I didn't remember seeing. It was a picture of my mother. She was standing in the kitchen, holding a mixing bowl, smiling in that absent-minded way she did when someone interrupted her while cooking. But the angle was strange. It wasn't taken from where someone would normally stand. It was low, almost floor level, tilted just slightly upward like a child had taken it while hiding under the table. And behind her, barely visible, was a thin black figure reflected in the microwave door. Its proportions were off. Too tall, too narrow. Its head leaned at a wrong angle, like it didn't understand where its neck ended and the wall began. I closed the album and shoved it back in the box. I tried to go about the day normally. Lucy needed breakfast, the plumbing in the upstairs bathroom was acting up, and there were still a dozen boxes left to unpack. I told myself this was what grieving did. It made you see things, feel connections where there weren't any. But little things started happening. Subtle things. The kinds of things you ignore at first, until there are too many to ignore. First, the mirror in the hallway fogged up every night around 3:15 a.m., even though no one had showered. When I'd wipe it down, faint streaks remained, like something had pressed against it. A hand, a cheek. Then Lucy started asking questions. Who's the woman in the closet? At first, I thought she was just playing. Kids her age invent friends, monsters, ghosts. It's all part of growing up. But she wasn't smiling when she asked. I remember sitting beside her while she drew with her crayons in the living room. She was making a picture of our house, rough rectangles and scribbled windows. She pointed to one of the windows upstairs. That's where she watches from. My stomach tightened. Who? I asked. She didn't look at me when she replied. The woman with moss on her face. That night, I locked the attic again. I didn't nail it shut. I wasn't ready to admit I was afraid. But I pushed a heavy steamer trunk in front of the door and told myself it was temporary. That same night, the bedroom light flickered. Once. Then again. I changed the bulb. Still flickered. But only between 3:10 and 3:30 a.m. The same time the hallway mirror fogged. I started waking up feeling watched. Not scared, just observed. Like something was standing at the foot of the bed, studying me. One night, I took a photo in the dark, just to prove there was nothing there. In the flash, I saw something. Barely. Not a face. Not a figure. Just a streak of green. Like moss had grown in midair and was caught in the burst of light before retreating. I didn't sleep that night. A week later, I decided to hang up the family photo wall in the hallway. It had been a tradition in the Wren household, a grid of smiling faces going back generations, framed in a patchwork of styles. Brass, wood, silver. I arranged them like I remembered. My parents on the far left, Eric and I below them, grandparents beside, all the way down to Lucy and me at the bottom right. That evening, while Lucy napped, I took one last look at the wall. Everything seemed in place. Familiar. Warm. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. In my parents' photo, my father's eyes were slightly shifted, not toward the camera, but to the left toward something off frame. The next day, another photo changed. My grandmother's frame was tilted slightly down, and in the reflection of her glass was the same shadow tree I had seen in the moss-covered album. I dusted every frame, cleaned the glass, centered them again. But the next night, they shifted back. The moss was creeping. First just hints, greenish stains along the frames. Then it spread, over the glass, into the photographs themselves. By the end of the week, nearly half the photos had a faint green filter, like they'd been left in a damp forest and forgotten. That's when I decided to call my Aunt Maureen. She was my mom's sister, lived in Vermont. We hadn't spoken much since the funeral. I called under the pretense of asking about the photo albums. She was quiet for a long time after I mentioned the moss. Then she said, "It's starting again." I asked what she meant. She didn't answer for several seconds. "You were too young to remember. But your mother, she used to see things in that house. So did I once. But your mom, she started hiding the photos. So they changed when no one was looking. Said she could hear breathing in the hallway mirror." My skin crawled. She had the attic sealed. Maureen continued. "It got worse after your brother died." I froze. "My brother's alive," I said quietly. More silence. "Caleb," she whispered, "your brother drowned in the creek behind the house when you were 6. You went missing for 3 hours. When they found you, you were clutching his jacket and repeating, 'He's in the pictures now.'" That night, I went to Lucy's room. She was asleep, curled up beneath the blankets. But the closet door was open, just slightly, enough to show the darkness inside. I walked over and pulled it shut. The moment I did, something scraped on the inside. Just a faint, dragging sound. I flung it back open. Nothing there. Just her coats. A few stuffed animals. And the photo she had drawn, now taped to the back wall. I hadn't noticed before. But in the window, the one she'd pointed to, there was a dark green shape. The crayon had been pressed hard, over and over, until the paper buckled beneath it. I took the drawing down and turned to leave. As I did, I caught my reflection in the window, and behind me, just over my shoulder, something moved. A sliver of green, a smear of shadow. I turned. Nothing. But the glass still fogged slightly, as if something had just exhaled against it. You can't unsee certain things. You could try to explain them away, wrap them up in the cloth of memory and childhood trauma, but the truth seeps out, slowly, steadily, like water through a rotting ceiling. The day after the call with Aunt Maureen, I sat on the floor of the living room staring at the photo wall. The green tint was spreading, no longer just subtle discoloration, but creeping vines of moss pressing against the inside of the glass, curling along edges, obscuring faces. It was especially thick on the frame that held Eric's photo, my brother. But Maureen had said he drowned. I couldn't trust my own memories anymore. That was the scariest part. What was real and what wasn't? Had Eric ever left this house? I remembered growing up with him. We'd played in the woods, climbed the old sycamore tree behind the shed. We'd both been afraid of the basement's far wall, the cold corner that never seemed to thaw, even in the summer. I remembered his voice, his laugh, But when I tried to picture his face clearly, what he looked like at 9, I couldn't. It was like looking into a mirror fogged by age. I knew he'd been there, but his outline kept blurring, his features sliding away just when I thought I had them pinned down. So I went into the basement. I hadn't touched it since we moved back in. It still smelled like mildew and rust, thick and metallic in the back of my throat. The air felt heavier down there, thicker, like it had weight. The concrete floor was cracked near the boiler, and the far wall, the one I'd always been afraid of, looked darker than it should have. Not shadowed, just stained, like something had seeped out from inside the wall and dried in strange, branching patterns. I remembered something. Eric and I had been playing hide and seek. I was it. He'd run down into the basement. That was the last time I saw him. Not the creek, not the woods, the basement. But when I asked my parents years later, they told me he'd wandered into the forest and slipped into the creek. They said I must have been confused. Had they lied? I reached out and touched the wall. It was warm, not just residual heat from a boiler. It throbbed like something pulsing just beneath the concrete. And then, I swear to God, it moved. Just an inch. A subtle shift, like the wall breathed against my hand. I yanked back. The room fell silent, except for the faint drip. Drip. Drip coming from the ceiling above me. I went back upstairs. Lucy wasn't in her bed when I checked. The covers were kicked aside, and the closet door was wide open. For a second, my heart dropped, but then I heard her voice, faint, coming from the hallway. I found her standing outside the door to the attic. Her small fingers rested on the old wooden frame, nails tracing the outline of the doorknob. "She wants to come down," she said quietly. I knelt beside her. "Who, Lucy?" "The moss lady." She sat. I felt something clench in my gut. "Did she talk to you?" Lucy nodded. "She doesn't have a mouth, but she still talks." Inside my head, that night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in the kitchen, just like the photo, but the room was wrong. The light was sickly green. Moss grew from the ceiling like upside-down vines, and the refrigerator door was swinging open and shut, even though there was no wind. She turned to me slowly. "Why did you bring her back?" she asked. "Bring who?" But her face began to peel away, skin flaking like damp wallpaper, revealing not bone, but photos. Hundreds of tiny, moss-covered photographs where her flesh should have been. And behind her eyes, roots. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The sheets were damp. The bedroom mirror was fogged again. The time? 3:13 a.m. There were handprints on the mirror now. Not mine. Not Lucy's. Too long. Fingers stretched like they'd been grown instead of formed. The next morning, I went back to the attic. I had to understand. The moss-covered photo album was still there, but it had changed. There were more pages now. I didn't remember adding any. I hadn't touched it since that first night. But now, there were photos I'd never seen before. Grainy shots of our backyard, the woods, a tree I didn't recognize, and one photo of a crib. It was old, rotted at the edges, set in the center of a circular patch of dead grass. Inside it was something wrapped in a blue baby blanket, but the skin that peeked out was gray-green. Veined. The caption beneath the photo read, where it began. My hands trembled. I flipped further. There were now photos of Lucy. In her room, sleeping. One showed her standing beside the closet, smiling up at the ceiling. Another showed her staring into the attic, even though she'd never been up there, at least not with me. And then the final page. A photograph of me, taken from behind, sitting on the floor of the living room staring at the photo wall. The photo had been taken the day before. I hadn't heard the shutter. I lived alone with Lucy. I ran my hand over the image. The surface was damp. It smelled like wet leaves and something sour. Moss was starting to grow on my shirt in the picture. Over the next few days, I stopped sleeping. The house was changing. Slowly, subtly. The air vents whispered. I could never make out the words, but the rhythm was there. Like breath. Lucy started drawing obsessively. Always in green. Always that figure, the woman with a moss-covered face. The lines of her body were starting to take shape. Too long. Too twisted. I tried to take the crayons away, but she cried for hours. "She'll get mad if I stop," she whispered. I asked her who she was again. Lucy just pointed to the photo wall. All the faces in the photos were now covered in moss. Hashtag the trapdoor. It was a Tuesday when I noticed the soft spot in the floor under the photo wall. I stepped there by accident. The wood groaned, gave just slightly. I pulled the rug away and found a square cutout. Hidden. Old. A trapdoor. It had no handle, just a shallow depression. I used a screwdriver to pry it up. Beneath was a narrow crawl space, only a few feet deep. But something sat inside. A box, covered in wax paper and twine. The inside was lined with faded blue cloth, the same pattern that had been on the baby blanket in the photo album. Inside the box, teeth. Dozens of tiny baby teeth. Some were still embedded in gums, gray-green, wrapped in gauze that had long since rotted into moss. I dropped it and stumbled back. My vision blurred. The room tilted. And I heard it then, clear as day. A gasping breath behind me. Like someone just waking up. I hadn't slept in over 36 hours. The house creaked more now, as if every floorboard had become brittle with age. I tried telling myself it was natural, just humidity warping the wood, the wind pressing against old siding. But deep down I knew it wasn't. It felt alive, listening, responding. The photographs on the hallway wall had changed again. Where there had once been a smiling portrait of my grandmother, her wide hat catching the sun as she stood in the garden, now only moss remained, thick and damp, curling over the glass from the inside. The frame was warped, wet to the touch, and behind that veil of green, something else, a silhouette, faint, barely visible unless you caught it in the right light. Not her. I didn't recognize the face. It had sunken features, blank eyes. And I swear it moved. The moss is in me now, not figuratively, not in some dreamlike, poetic sense. I'm not speaking in riddles. I've begun pulling flakes of it from my fingernails. It started with itching. The kind you get after walking through tall grass in the woods, where the invisible sting of nettles brushes your skin and leaves a lasting, crawling memory. I scratched at my arms until they bled, until the skin under my nails turned raw. But even that didn't relieve the sensation. Then I found it green specks clinging to my sheets, on the inside of my pillowcase, embedded in my toothbrush. I stopped sleeping. The mirrors in the house won't reflect my face properly anymore. Every time I glance at one, it lags, like a glitch in an old videotape. My reflection doesn't move at the same speed as I do. It lingers, sometimes even stares back long after I've turned away. Once I saw my mouth move in the mirror, but I hadn't said anything. And that's not the worst of it. There's a new photo in the hallway. It appeared on the wall overnight. A grainy black and white picture in a tarnished silver frame. The kind you'd find in an antique store. It shows a little boy sitting on a staircase, maybe 6 or 7 years old. His clothes are old-fashioned, buttoned shirt, short trousers, thick socks. But the most unsettling detail is his face. He doesn't have one. Or rather, it's obscured. Not blurred, not scratched out, but covered entirely by a thick smear of moss pressed on the inside of the glass. As if something grew in the frame. As if it wanted to hide his identity. When I tried removing it, the glass wouldn't budge. I scraped and pressed and tapped, but the moss wouldn't peel away. It pulsed. That night, I heard footsteps on the staircase. Small ones. I started hearing breathing again, slow and wheezing, but it wasn't coming from the vents. I followed the sound through the kitchen, past the pantry, and toward the small closet under the stairs. I'd always thought of it as dead space. Never used it, but now the door was ajar. There was a puddle of green-black water leaking from beneath it. I pushed the door open. Darkness. The kind that seems to suck the light out of your flashlight's beam. The walls inside were covered in a thick, pulpy layer of moss. It wasn't decorative, not the kind that trends in minimalist boutiques. It was alive, slick, breathing. When I leaned in, I saw something moving underneath. Not rats. Bigger. A slow, undulating shape, like a lung inflating just behind the drywall. And then I heard it speak. A whisper. Low. Muffled. As if coming from inside the insulation. I was forgotten. But I remember you. I slammed the door and didn't open it again for 3 days. In the attic, I found something new, or maybe it had always been there and I just never noticed. A large corkboard, mounted crookedly against the brick chimney. A family tree, hand-drawn in what looked like faded ink or dried blood. The branches extended far beyond what I knew about our lineage. Names I'd never heard before. Dozens of them, all scratched into the paper with a shaking hand. All linked to one common root at the base of the tree. Hollow. That was the name at the base. Not a person, just a word. Hollow. But then something else. Scribbled beside the word was a note in a child's handwriting. He is made of moss. He eats memory. He wants to be family again. By the end of September, I stopped sleeping entirely. I go to bed because that's what people do, but I never close my eyes anymore. I couldn't. Something about the stillness at night let the house stretch and breathe, and I swear I could hear it. A creaking not like old wood, but like lungs inflating. The corners of the rooms would contract and expand ever so slightly, as if they weren't just structural after all, but ribs. It started the day I tried to throw out the picture frames. After the incident with Uncle Pete's photo, the moss threading through the glass, curling like a tongue against his face, I had boxed up all the remaining family photos and shoved them in the attic. Out of sight, out of mind. But the attic didn't want them either. I found them unpacked on the kitchen table one morning, arranged neatly, glass polished, faces clearer than ever. My hand shook when I picked up the photo of my grandfather, the one who died before I was born. The moss had spread behind the glass like green smoke, obscuring everything but his eyes. And those eyes, they were too sharp, too present. That was the first time I felt it watching me. Not from the corners or behind a curtain like before. I felt it from inside the walls. I made a decision that day. Burn the pictures. I didn't care how wrong it felt. I took the whole box to the backyard, built a small fire pit, and tossed them in. At first, the flames licked the edges, curling the photos like leaves. But then the fire began to sputter. A foul, what hiss emerged from the blaze. The smoke turned a strange shade of green, and then the fire went out. Dead out. I dug into the ashes hoping the photos had at least been damaged, but what I found made my throat tighten. The photos were completely intact, but they weren't the same. In one, my mother stood in the kitchen holding me as a baby. In the original, her face had been full of joy. Now her mouth was open, not in a smile, but in a scream. Behind her, something shadowy loomed. A hand on her shoulder. A grin carved into the dark. A presence that had never been there before. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't just imagining it anymore. The house began to smell like damp earth. Not always, just sometimes. Usually right before something shifted. A door would be open when I swore I closed it. The bathroom mirror would fog up when no one had taken a shower. And just once, I saw something drip from the ceiling and splatter onto the floor. It wasn't water. It was thick, green, and cold. I started hearing noises beneath the floorboards. Not mice. Not rats. Something larger. Something that breathed. It was around that time I got the call from my cousin Derek. He said he'd been doing some digging into the family history after I told him about the moss on the photos. He said our great-grandmother, Lillian, had been a practicing spiritualist back in the 1920s. Not just seances and tea leaves, blood rites. Nature rituals. Offerings to something she called the rooted mother. She believed she could make the family live forever. Derek sent me scanned pages of her handwritten journal. The passages were almost unreadable. Most were prayers written in Old English, mixed with Latin. But one section stood out. She called it the binding. Bind the image to the seed. Bind the name to the green. When flesh rots, the root shall remain. And from the photo, they shall return. That was the night the moss began to grow on the walls. Not just in patches now. It crept in thick lines, forming shapes. Human-like outlines. Faces. Arms. Open mouths. Every time I scraped it off, it grew back faster. It became clear the photos weren't just showing the dead. They were keeping them alive. On October 3rd, I heard a voice inside the photo album. I hadn't opened it in weeks. It had been locked away in a basement, wrapped in garbage bags, sealed inside a cooler. But that night I heard it, breathing, whispering, calling my name. I took it out and opened it with trembling hands. The voice stopped. Instead, I found a new photo had appeared. It was a picture of me, standing in the hallway, asleep, and behind me, a figure covered in vines stood half emerged from the wall. Its hand was on my shoulder. That night I tried to leave. I packed what I could and drove until the road curved into fog and vanished into the trees. I kept driving. No matter how far I went, every road led back to the same street. The same dead trees. The same house. I think the house is part of them now. Or maybe it always was. I don't know how to begin this final piece of what I can only call a confession. It's no longer a story. It's not even about what I saw or thought I understood. It's about what I became, what I brought into this world. There's no undoing it now. I'm writing this from a motel room 3 states away from that cursed house, but I swear I can still smell the moss. Damp, rotting, ancient. After my last entry, I did what anyone would do. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, took only what I could carry, and didn't even stop to lock the door. The photos, or what remained of them, had started curling inwards, the moss feeding on them in ways that defied logic. Not just spreading over the surface, but burrowing beneath. The faces inside were changing. Not growing old or young, but becoming someone else. Familiar, yet impossibly wrong. I made it as far as the car when I saw my mother. She was standing at the edge of the woods behind the property. Only it wasn't my mother anymore. Her face was. hollow, not missing, inverted, like it had collapsed in on itself. The eyes now deep, root-dark hollows, and her mouth twitching with something unsaid, something living inside. She raised one hand, and moss poured from the sleeves of her old nightgown. I turned and ran. The motel was a dying relic off a side road. The kind of place that shouldn't exist anymore. Rotary phones, buzzing yellow lights, and a TV that only played static. But it was cheap, and most importantly, far. I thought I'd escaped. I was wrong. The first night, I woke to scratching above me. The ceiling fan spun slowly, but behind it, the plaster was flaking. Something scraped just beyond it, deliberate and rhythmic, like fingernails on old wood. I told myself it was just rats. Or the pipes. The second night, I dreamed of the family photos. They were in a pile at my feet. I reached down to touch one, a picture of my father, smiling at me like he used to. When I turned it over, the entire back was furred in thick, black moss, and it moved in my hand. It pulsed. Then it spoke. Not with words, but with memory. I was no longer in the dream. I was back in the house, in the living room, watching my younger self draw crayon stick figures of our family. Except the drawing included someone else. A tall figure behind the rest of us. No face, no name, just watching. When I woke, my pillow was damp with mildew. The truth comes out. It wasn't until I visited the local library, desperate for answers, that I finally found what I didn't want to know. The house wasn't new to the strange. A series of disappearances, all undocumented beyond whispers in small-town back rooms. A string of families who moved in, only to vanish or break apart in horrific, whispered ways. One article, yellowed, brittle, had a photo attached that made me physically ill. The family in the image was mine. Not exactly, but close. Same number of people. Same poses. Same layout on the porch. And behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the doorway, a blur. A smear. A presence. I went outside to breathe. I vomited in the bushes behind the library. When I came back inside, every photo on the wall had moss blooming in its corners. I never touched them, but I heard them crunch as I walked past. The final descent. It happened last night. I had made peace in some dark corner of my mind with the fact that I would never be free of it. I had read horror stories, seen the tropes. The cursed object, the haunted house, the unknowable entity. I thought I had an understanding of what was happening to me. But understanding is not immunity. At 3:13 a.m., I woke to complete silence. Even the motel's ancient refrigerator had stopped humming. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. I turned on the light, and there it was. The crib. The same crib that had been locked in the attic of my family home. That awful, dust-caked relic with the claw marks on its frame and the bundle of moss inside. It stood in the corner of the room now, impossibly large. The shadows beneath it moved. I couldn't breathe. And then the bulb above me flickered, buzzed, and burst. In that brief moment of dying light, I saw it. Something was crawling out of the crib. Long, thin limbs. No eyes. A yawning mouth filled with wet green. And then it spoke. You grew me. You fed me. You framed me. You looked away. It lunged. Now, I don't know what's real anymore. I'm writing this in a notebook I found in the drawer of this room. My phone is gone. The mirror over the sink reflects someone else's face, a version of me, but not quite. Its eyes are too wide. Its smile never moves. Photos of me and my family, from my childhood, now hang in this motel room. Each one has moss growing slowly over the faces. I tried burning one. The smoke that poured out whispered names I'd never said aloud. And the worst part? I hear in the walls. A baby crying, then laughing, then gasping. I don't think I'll leave this room. I'm afraid if I open the door, it'll be waiting. Not the crib, not the moss. Me. A version of me that grew in that dark, in the silence, and learned to want. If anyone reads this, don't keep old photos. Don't trust what smiles back at you. And for the love of God, if you see moss on the faces in your frames, run.